I'll begin with a prayer. Asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityo ma amritam kamaya abhir ma eti rudrayate dakshinamukam te namam pahi nityam. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Light us through and through, and guide us evermore with thy loving presence. Peace, peace, peace be unto all beings.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On past occasions when Swami Chaitanananda has asked me to stand in, I have largely, for personal edification, taken those topics which I have thought were uniquely Vedantic in its origin and concept, and has remained central to its philosophy. This morning's topic of life after death is not uniquely Vedantic, although it is extremely important in its philosophical teachings and in our faith in what it teaches. The reason it is not uniquely Vedantic is because almost all the major religions believe in the existence of a soul and believe in a life hereafter. But where they divide is at the point of death. I am not a student of comparative religions, and what I would like to do this morning is present to you, as best as I understand it, Vedantic teachings on life after death. On the surface, it would seem that the term is contradictory. Death is a finality. And if one speaks of a life after death, either the term is inappropriately used, or there is a life that we don't necessarily tangibly appreciate while we live, and don't necessarily recognize how it could live after us. And this is where I think Vedanta explains itself. The question may be asked whether science can verify or prove what Vedanta teaches, or what one might believe in its teachings. And Vedanta would say, no, it cannot be proven by science for a couple of reasons. Science largely deals with matter, while the concept of the life hereafter has as its core spirit. Science tests and verifies using the senses, while Vedantic teachings, particularly of this nature, have arisen from the depths of deep meditation, which transcends the senses. Until a few months ago, I didn't particularly concern myself about the various technicalities that Vedanta has used which I'm afraid I'm obligated to use this morning when I talk to you in trying to explain life after death, because I largely concentrated only on the broad aspect of trying to separate the non-self from the self spelt with a capital S. But I really don't think that one could appreciate, or I certainly know I wouldn't have been able to appreciate Vedanta's teachings on life after death without understanding some of its definitions and terms that it uses in trying to define man. And if the question is asked, who are we? What is man? The answer would depend on whom you ask the question. A biologist would describe us as belonging to the animal kingdom. We are born, we grow, we feed, we dwell, we breed, and we decay. A vitalist may have a different definition, an economist may have a different definition. Sigmund Freud believed that the core of man was his libido. And although part of these definitions may in fact be true, what Vedanta says it lacks is any description of the spirit. And so, in trying to describe what is called the psychophysical man, it describes us as having 3 bodies and 5 sheaths. And I'll try and explain them as simply as I can. The 3 bodies are divided into a gross body, which I think all of us can comprehend without too much difficulty. Then there is a causal body. I beg your pardon. After the gross body is the subtle body, and then there is a causal body. And the 5 sheaths that represent us are called the physical sheath, which I think we intuitively can recognize. And then it speaks of a sheath of vital principle. And the vital principle is called, one of the vital principles is prana, which is breath. But it is not the exclusive vital principle. For instance, without digressing too far, let me give you an example. It is said that when a person goes into samadhi, you have completely nulled your senses. And a recent example of that being Sri Ramakrishna. It is said that for somebody observing this, for physical purposes, would almost think the person is dead, because you don't feel a breath, and presumably a pulse isn't palpated, but the body still has heat, unlike a body that is dead. And there are a number of these things that belong to the autonomic nervous system that constitute prana. And I will say no more about the vital principle, and we can just use the term as the first sheath being that of prana. The next sheath is described as the sheath of the mind. And the mind that Vedanta describes here is that mind which doubts and which deliberates and which examines. And the third sheath is, this would be the fourth sheath, is the sheath of the intellect. And this is the determinative faculty, where the mind examines and deliberates, the intellect determines. Then there is the sheath of bliss, and finally there is a soul. In describing these sheaths, what Vedanta essentially says is we go from the coarse to the fine, and it's rather like a telescope, in that the finest, which is the soul, is innermost, and the coarsest, which is the body, is outer. And therefore you have a physical sheath, and within that is the sheath of vital principle. Then you have the mental sheath, the intellectual sheath, the sheath of bliss, and then the soul. That is the psychophysical composition of man according to Vedanta. And with this psychophysical composition, we pay attention to the physical aspects of life, the aesthetic aspects of life, the intellectual aspects of life, the moral aspects of life, and the spiritual aspects of life. Now, of these sheets, I think, at least to me it seems, the most important ones that influence our births, influence our lives, and influence the life hereafter are the prana, the mental sheath, and the intellectual sheath. These three sheaths are said to belong to the subtle body. So the physical sheath belongs to the gross body, the vital principle, the mental sheath, and the intellectual sheath belong to the subtle body. The sheath of bliss belongs to the causal body. I'll just say one thing about the sheath of bliss and then move on. To appreciate these different sheaths, Vedanta would say, what do we in a working day, this psychophysical man, what do we encounter in a working day? And it would say you encounter three states: the waking state, and the state of sleep. And the state of sleep can be sleep with dreams, and there can be dreamless sleep. This is essentially our existence. Now, in the waking state, the subtle body, which consists of the vital principle, which consists of the mental sheath and the intellectual sheath, projects on the body. That's what happens in the working state, in the waking state. In sleep with dreams, the mental sheath and the intellectual sheath and the vital sheath reside in what is called the subtle body when we dream. And the subtle body, because of the mind and the intellect being in it, draws upon its own experiences which generate dreams. The state of dreamless sleep, it is said that all of these sheaths reside in the causal body. And it is said it is in that state that we are probably the closest to divine bliss, in that state of dreamless sleep. And apparently people can glimpse this bliss or feel it when they wake up. And I suppose by extension, one could say that in the deepest meditation, when one isn't really asleep but is said to be awake, and one feels bliss, it is probably because the physical sheath and the subtle body are in the causal body. I would think that that's what it would be by extension. So now for the rest of my talk, I just want to spend some time talking about the causal body, because that seems to influence who we are and where we go and why we are what we are. The causal body, which consists of our mind and our intellect with the vital principle, is said to be a repository of all our subtle forces. Everything we think, we say, and we act has an effect. That effect resides in our subtle body. Our tendencies, our capabilities, our good, our evil reside in this subtle body, and this largely is what our psychosocial complex is. And in time, these impressions become prevalent and they influence what happens at the time of death. At the time of death, the body is left behind and the external world is left behind. But the vital principle, the mental sheath, the intellectual sheath, and the causal body are said to leave the physical body. So at the point of death, we leave with a mind that has a certain number of impressions that we have accrued in this mortal state. we are reborn with the same mind and with the same intellect. And the reason we are born with the same mind and intellect, it would say, is because we have left a previous body with desires unfulfilled. So we come back to fulfill those desires. And we also need to reap what we sow. So, and Vedanta is very clear about this, and very unambiguous about this. If I speak of my mind, it is not a mind that I have got from my parents. They have given me a body. This is a mind that belonged to another body in a previous birth. What has changed is the body, but not the mind. It gets recycled. And therefore, every life here is a rebirth. It goes on to say that this subtle body betokens our previous incarnation, and it also portends our future. It also says, let us say that at the time of death, things that we can relate to, there's a poetic genius, a great artist, great literary skill, a great musical voice. These will be manifest in a future birth. And Vedanta says this really is the only way you can explain the inequalities of life at the time of birth. Inequalities, I think, that we all recognize in the closest blood relatives of a family. Born to the same parents, given the same opportunities, take divergent paths, divergent talents. And it is because these blood relatives are born with their own minds. For instance, there are some Western philosophers who use the term tabula rasa, implying that when we are born, our mind is a blank slate. And Vedanta objects to this in the strongest terms. Admittedly, when a baby is born and is entirely dependent on the mother for sustenance and has no motor skills and looks completely helpless, it is very easy to think of that baby as not having a mind, because we think we project our minds and project our intellects through speech, through action. But what Vedanta says is that baby has a mind. That baby has impressions. And those are impressions from a previous birth. And they will manifest as that baby becomes an adult and grows. And because it says you cannot be born with a mind that starts at zero and then go on to something and then expect this mind to go on to eternity. So it very, very emphatically states that even a child under those circumstances does have a mind, and it's a mind that has been created by previous births. Now, as I said, just the way talents, the positive things, may travel with us, wrong tendencies and shortcomings are always conveyed the same way. And very unambiguously, and this is where I think science may strongly object to what Vedanta says, but Vedanta says we agree. I mean, there are scientists who disagree, and there are some scientists who agree, and then there are some scientists who are ambivalent about it. But it says in our makeup, heredity and environment are subsidiary. What is primary is the mind that we are born with, which is a mind that belonged to us in the past. Now, that largely is what it talks about the subtle body. Then one might ask, what is it that influences this subtle body? Or we might ask the question differently. What are those influences on this subtle body that manifest as effect in this mortal life? And what are the things that we could do that could influence this subtle body for a better life, however one defines a better life? And here Vedanta moves into the law of karma, essentially shaping what our subtle body is. Karma has been defined as action. But in this context, what Vedanta says is that karma is strictly volitional, and it's an action based on one's power to choose one's course of action. So it is action that is volitional. That action is said to have two results. One that is immediate and cognizable, and another that is remote and hidden. And by the same argument, therefore, it would go on to say that any karma, therefore any action, physical, verbal, mental, apart from producing an immediate and visible result, also has on the mind a very relevant impression which dwells as a potency and will inevitably be manifest, usually in a subsequent birth. In essence, as I understand it, and if I'm mistaken, I would like to be corrected when we meet after this talk, but as I understand it, in this life, we are living out our actions of a past life. In our next life, unless we attain the divine experience in this life, in our next life, we will live out the experiences stemming from the actions of this life. See, Vedanta is unable to accept that one reaps what one sows in one mortal life. If you take the Shakespearean 70 years being the duration of a human life, it says it's far too short for you to reap what you sow. It is also far too short to explain how you can fulfill your unfulfilled desires. It also says that if in this life we live an immoral and improper, harmful, hurtful life, it does not mean we ought to go to hell forever. There has to be hope. There has to be redemption. And that hope and that redemption and the opportunity to improve, to refine, to become self-purified only comes through subsequent births. And therefore, it does not accept that everything that we are going to experience is the result of an action of this mortal life. It says that therefore action, one's karma, which one chooses by one's own volition, builds one's own character. It's also retributive at a later time. It is cause, it is effect. One reaps what one sows. It is not fate, it is not chance, it is not accident. and that the present life really is the result of past actions, and the future life is a result of present actions. And that at death, the mind, with the impressions produced by one's karma, stored in the subtle body, with the soul, leaves the physical body until it finds another body. And therefore, this life that we are living is essentially a rebirth. The Vedantic view is that a man's present existence is a link in a continuous chain of life marked by a succession of births and deaths forged by his own karma and consequence. And that the prime factor in the origination and the development of an individual is the individual himself or herself. Everything else is subsidiary. It really gives you very little wiggle room to blame anyone else for one's hardship. And here again, it would say this is most evident in prodigies. How does a child of 9 or 10 reflect musical genius or any sort of genius? And often these children are born to parents who at best might be considered mediocre in that particular talent that the child displays. We know of situations where extraordinarily intelligent parents have had children who are mentally deficient. And we wonder how. And we ask why. And Vedanta would say this is where the answer resides. It's a very, very difficult thing to comprehend because, particularly with blood relatives, we feel that everything is so closely tied in that the child is the product of the parents. It doesn't appear to be that close a reproduction as Vedanta would have one, or as we believe right now. And Vedanta would say where the reproduction is similar would be in physical traits and in genetic transmission. And that essentially, therefore, we are a succession of births and deaths, and we are one and the same individual. If I was to say that I am a newly fashioned individual in this life, I'm mistaken. My mind is old. My intellect is old. My body is new. New for this world. And then it would be discarded. My mind and my intellect will move on. And it says that all along we retain the same mind, which is separable from the body. And the progress is dependent primarily on the development of the mind and secondarily the body. I think this is really very critical. When Vedanta speaks about progress of the mind, what really does it mean? In our lives, when we speak of progress of the mind or the intellect, we speak of the acquisition of knowledge, the acquisition of skills, the ability to hold one's own in the working world, to be self-reliant, and to be independent, all of which are extremely important. But in this context, when Vedanta speaks of a progress of the mind, and I say to myself that if I believe my mind is old, that I am living my life now and I am experiencing life's experiences because of my actions of a past life, how does the cycle end? And how does this mind progress? What does Vedanta mean by progress? It does not mean the acquisition of knowledge. It does not mean the refinement of one's intellect. It essentially speaks of progress through purity. The various yogas have talked about the attainment of that purity through action, through devotion, through meditation, through knowledge. That is the progress that I think Vedanta speaks of in every life. And what is the end result of this physical body? It says it can take perhaps 4 parts. When your mind and your intellect and your vital principle and your causal body and your soul leave your physical body, it can take 4 parts. One of them, they refer to it as Brahmaloka, that you have attained one with Brahman. You have become one with God. You have broken the cycle of life and death. You have broken the cycle of weal and woe and suffering. Has had the divine experience. Most humans, they normally don't survive for more than 3 weeks. And those people who have been observed in that state have found these people in a state of divine intoxication, where they see no difference between man and woman, they see no difference between child and adult, and they see just divinity everywhere. That's been the description. Such a person in that state has reached the culmination, has become one with the divine, which is the goal of religion, and will not be reborn. Then it says there is another state that because of extreme meritorious actions and great purity, you reach a state of a heavenly association where life is rich and life is enjoyable and life is very pleasant, but even such an individual is reborn to live out unfulfilled desires. But for most of us, I would venture to suggest there appear to be 2 parts according to Vedanta. One, when your soul leaves your body with the different sheaths, it ceases to be male, female, or neuter. Your gender is determined by the body that soul enters. The soul has been described as being eternal, ever pure, and pure consciousness without a gender. The other interesting thing that Vedanta says is it's the child that chooses the parent. In essence, therefore, this soul picks into which family it might be born into. So the reincarnation that a soul would experience is dependent on past actions. In unusual circumstances, and I'm told it's unusual, or I've read it's unusual, is that you can come back subhuman, depending on how one lived a past life. But the law of karma acts only on the human state. And therefore, this is why it is considered a highly blessed state to be in, because through your own volitional actions, you can work towards your own liberation. Now, I think most people here would say that we are aspirants. We are trying to purify ourselves. We are trying to be better people in the broader sense. We recognize that we have flaws, we recognize we falter. What is our karma? And Arjuna asks Krishna this question in the Gita, which I think is really quite a beautiful passage. It's a beautiful passage because it really seems to typify our state. Arjuna asks Krishna, he says, what if a person is possessed of faith but is not steadfast in practice, wanders from the ideal, fails to reach the goal, fallen from the temporal and the eternal? Will he perish like a cloud rent asunder? Dispel this doubt, O Krishna. So Krishna says, verily, neither here nor hereafter is there destruction for him. For he who strives after the supreme good never comes to grief. Reborn to a propitious family, regains acquired understanding and strives for perfection harder than before. So, in other words, that no effort goes unrewarded. Now, Krishna says, comes to no grief, and it's the sort of thing that we would like to grab and hold on to and say, how wonderful if we can be reborn and not have to experience grief. But this is not possible. This is simply not possible. In the human state, there will be sorrow. There will be dualities, as we well know. There will be sadness. There will be happiness. There will be health. There will be sickness. There will be life. There will be death. There is no escaping from these dualities. And therefore, one may say, if an individual bears or is afflicted by what we might term is undue suffering, is he a saint or is he a sinner? And Vedanta says he is neither. Because what really matters or what really determines whether you are more saintly or you might tend to sin when facing suffering is how you cope with it. And it advises that you might turn to spiritual insight, you might surrender to the will of God, you might try and understand the law of karma and adapt. And I really think that to a large extent, essentially, what it makes us think of time and life is much beyond the very limited scope with which we live our lives. And Vedanta emphasizes without any ambivalence that just as it is important for us to examine life, it is very important to examine the mystery of death. And this is why it has gone, it seems to me, to a great extent to explain the mystery of death and what happens after death. Swami Vivekananda referred to it as that grand truth, coming to terms with death. We know that death brings sadness, it brings grief because of our attachments, of our loves, of our memories, of our hopes, which is perfectly understandable. But not to examine death is a mistake, because if you don't examine it, you become frightened of it. And you become frightened of it because you don't understand it. And what essentially Vedanta tries to say is, try and understand it. And it is as much a part of all the attention you pay to life and living. And that death is just one little link in the chain. And it is not the finality that we think it to be. What I'd like to do is just read one or two passages that other traditions have spoken about death. A Persian Sufi master and poet said, "O man, remember death at all times." In Ecclesiastics, we find this instruction, "In all thy works, remember thy last end, and thou shalt never sin." A samurai and author wrote, "The idea most vital and essential to the samurai is that of death, which he ought to have before his mind day and night, night and day, from the dawn of the first day of the year till the last minute of the last day of it." Shingon, a student of Zen, remarked, "Zen has no secrets other than seriously thinking about birth and death." In The Imitation of Christ, it says, "Thou oughtest so to order thyself in all thy thoughts and actions as if today thou wert to die." And as we all know, when Buddha was Siddhartha and left the palace, he was mystified by disease and death, completely mystified, and spent the rest of his whole life thinking about it. And when he found that he had an answer, he became enlightened, as we speak of him, and that was the birth of Buddhism 2,500 years ago. And so I think the subject of death is not one to be shied from. It is not one to be avoided. It is one to be examined, I think, just the way we examine birth and life, as we tend to do, more than we do death. Now, one of the things that I would like to do is, much of what I have summarized for you today really comes from the Upanishads, and I don't think I have in any way come near the beautiful translations, and I'll just read a few passages to you. The beautiful translations, at least even in English, where there's nothing lost in the translation, essentially discussing some of these aspects that have been mentioned here this morning. In the Katha Upanishad, a young man called Nachiketa goes to Yama. Yama is said to believed to be the Lord of Death, and asks this question in this phraseology. He says, "There is this doubt about a man when he is dead. Some say that he exists, others that he does not. This I should like to know, taught by you." So Yama tests him and says, "I'll send you to heaven, and I'll give you princesses, and I'll give you wealth, and you can lead a good life there." He says, "No, these are all evanescent. They will not last me. I wish to know what happens at death." So the first thing Yama tells him is that when you live your life, you have to draw a distinction between what is pleasant and what is good. And he said, most of us would like to have what is pleasant and what is good in our lives. But he said, that is as diverse as light and darkness. So you live a conscious life, pursuing what you believe is good, and not confusing what is pleasant with the good. That's a word of advice he gives him. Then he goes on to describe the soul, which the Hindus describe as the Atman. But before doing that, he draws an analogy of this human stage. I told you about what Vedanta describes as the psychosocial character of man. He takes the same analogy and says, take this body to be a chariot. Take the soul to be the master of that chariot. And the mind are the reins, the senses are the horses, and the road on which you travel are the sense objects. And essentially says that if the reins are not controlled, the sense object, which is represented by the horses, and the sense object, I beg your pardon, the senses, which represents the horses, being attracted to sense objects in our world, run amok. So you have to learn to control the reins, which is the mind, by the intellect, which is the charioteer. So he gives him this sort of advice, and then says the goal really is to know the Atman. Who is this, or what is this Atman? And I'm reading unexcerpted here. It says the nature of Atman is extremely difficult to grasp. It cannot be known by reasoning, however subtle. Many have not even heard of it, and many who have heard do not comprehend it. Atman is sometimes identified with the body and sometimes with the mind, and thus diversely regarded by those who try to understand it by reason. The true seeker of Atman, as a result of righteous action of the past, gradually develops non-attachment to material objects and feels a genuine longing for self-knowledge. And self is spelled with a capital S. Vain is the effort to understand Atman by mere discursive reasoning, which associates it with various notions of the impure mind. The mind cannot be pure until it has renounced all attachment to material objects on earth or in heavenly worlds, including Brahmaloka. And then he goes on to say that the Atman is inscrutable. It is very difficult to know it. And then he says the knowing self, which we might call the soul, is not born, it does not die. It has not sprung from anything, nothing has sprung from it. Birthless, eternal, everlasting, and ancient, it is not killed when the body is killed. For its direct self-realization, both self-effort and divine grace are necessary. And then he says, if you keep evolving this way, you quickly begin to realize that even meditation and prayer cease to have a certain value when you have reached that level of spiritual evolution. Because we still remain bound to our ego, and as best as I can understand it, I'll take a stab at trying to define ego. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is egocentric. But if one believes that one is represented by one's intellect, by one's mind, and one believes that one's intellect and one's mind is one's own agent, however unwittingly, you are still attached to your ego. If one reaches a state where completely, whatever actions we do, we intuitively attribute everything to the spirit and nothing to the mind or the intellect, you attain that level of purity, then you have separated yourself from ego. And then if you attain that level where you do not see yourself as being an agent of anything, then ultimately you're in a position with all purity to surrender to God, and then it's God's grace that ultimately gives you that experience. And finally, Yama says, Brahman must be realized in this very life before the falling asunder of the body. Then alone is a man liberated, otherwise he is embodied again in the physical world. Whosoever in this world of God give without knowing the imperishable, offers oblations, performs sacrifices, and practices austerities, even for many thousands of years, finds all such acts but perishable. Brahman is clearly experienced in a man's intellect when purified by self-control and meditation, as is one's reflection in a clean mirror. In other words, its manifestation is distinct. In order to realize Brahman, one has to separate it from the senses, the mind, and the external objects of the physical world. It is not experienced by sense organs, but revealed in the intellect, freed from doubt through constant meditation. And then the Katha Upanishad concludes that this Atman is not larger than a thumb. It always dwells in the hearts of men. Let a man separate it being spelt with a capital I, from his body with steadfastness, as one separates the tender stalk from a blade of grass, and then it is there to be experienced. Thank you.
I'll close with a prayer. Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadhaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. That unmanifest, all-pervading reality is full and complete. This manifested, ever-changing reality is full and complete. This fullness has come from that fullness, yet that fullness remains full and complete. Peace, peace, peace be unto all beings.